oil which could be gotten out within the next few years, and the country is too unstable, the political situation is too unstable to invest if you can't get your money out fast. I think it would be wrong to say that any one of these factors by itself would necessarily have stopped the oil companies. However, they did stop. As we all know, Sumev has not. The United States has as yet not expressed any opinion on the validity of the decree. It has said, as Milo Ann pointed out, that it would not protect any American investor against any action taken by a future government of Namibia if the American corporation went in after 1966, after the revocation of the mandate. Otherwise, that is probably a stronger position than that taken by any other Western country whose nationals have investments in Namibia, which of course demonstrates in part how weak positions are. The United States has had a very ambivalent position, which appears to be negative, on economic boycotts as a weapon to try to bring about change in Namibia. It has, as we know, vetoed proposals for arms embargo against South Africa to bring about change in Namibia. If you have read today's paper, you will notice that the 5 Western members of the Security Council plan to have meetings with the Prime Minister of South Africa next Wednesday to discuss a solution of the Namibian problem. Whether this will go beyond the abortive solution of the Zimbabwe problem, which we knew about last fall, of course, remains to be seen. I think perhaps I should stop now and answer questions.
I heard on the news this evening that there was a discussion again about a fund by the American government, which sounded precisely like the fund that was talked about last year to the Rhodesian settlers, only this time it included the Namibians, and it was to aid the majority regime. And I wondered if this was simply old wine in new bottles.
I wish I knew the answer to that. It does sound very much like it, although the amount is quite different. The Zimbabwe fund they were talking about in the nature of $1,500,000,000. This one is a small, by those standards, $100 million. It seems much too small to buy out white settlers that want to leave. It's not at all clear to me what the fund is for, and I think we're going to have to wait for some further explanation because the news stories are simply inadequate to have any real idea.
Yes, I understand there's a committee of 24 on decolonization at the UN. I'd like a little bit of information on that body, and I would like to compliment you on the way you denounced the South African illegal government. But at the same time, I would like to ask you a question. Can you identify any other people or bodies that are functioning in Africa that are holding that same frame of reference in terms of illegal governments? So the first question or statement would be, I would like some information on the Committee of 24 on decolonization. And second, if you could give us some examples or information towards some other people that you would accept as being in the same posture as that body in South Africa that you mentioned, illegal governments.
Well, let me start on the decolonization committee, which has a long title of about 25 words, special committee and so forth. That was established at a time when most of Africa, and I guess probably some of Asia, was still colonial territory, and its function has diminished, or at least the number of countries, territories to which it can direct its efforts has diminished as most of Africa has obtained its independence. There are only a handful of territories left, particularly since the end of Portuguese colonial rule, that come under the decolonization committee. Namibia, Zimbabwe, what used to be known as French Somaliland, which is going to have its fate settled one way or another, and some Pacific territories and odds and ends like Gibraltar, Pitcairn Island. The major territories now are Namibia and Zimbabwe. The others are relatively small pieces of territory scattered around all over the earth. There's a nice question, for example, as to whether or not Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands fall within or without the jurisdiction of the Committee of 24. As for the second question, Namibia is considered in every sense unique because it was an international territory in the sense that the mandate was an international system, and South Africa was at all times, theoretically at least, responsible to the League of Nations for its administration of Namibia, and after the League was defunct, to the United Nations. In that sense, it is a wholly unique territory, and there is nothing ever like it, because there has never been another territory except for very, very short periods of time. West Irian, for example, for a short time. I believe Libya for a short time, but for practical purposes, there has only been one territory that qualifies as really international territory, over which the United Nations has said that we hold ourselves out as the proper and lawful administrators. So in that sense, there is nothing like it in the world. Perhaps the second the closest territory would be Zimbabwe, which is technically British territory, but the British did turn to the United Nations and ask for help in ending the unlawful UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And to the extent that Britain went to the United Nations and said, please help us, that becomes an international territory which is unlawfully governed at this point, or unlawfully under unlawful administration at this point. When you get to other territories, you are then talking about individual judgments of particular countries or particular people, and not a stand which is taken by the United Nations as an organization. As you understand, when the Security Council acts, it must act with the consent of the 5 major powers. If any one of them vetoes, even though every other member of the Security Council is for an action, the action fails. In the General Assembly, you act normally by a normal majority, although in certain cases there must be a 2/3 majority. But for practical purposes, a General Assembly resolution which does not have overwhelming support is a very weak resolution, since the General Assembly can, in the first place, under normal circumstances, there are some abnormal circumstances, and Namibia is one of them, but normally the General Assembly can only recommend. It has no binding force to its resolutions. So that the United Nations functions mainly as a large number of individual nations speaking, and only rarely does it function as an organization itself. And so that many things which are considered bad by many countries do not come within any general judgment by the United Nations. In the subject of Palestine, you get into a question of certainly of acknowledgement by both the General Assembly and to some extent by the Security Council that certain parts of Palestine are wrongly held by Israel, and that would undoubtedly fall within the general definition. But in that sense, you have a very peculiar, you have a different situation from that in Zimbabwe, because in Zimbabwe the lawful authority said, come in and help us, which is a little different from the way the Palestinian issue has arisen in the United Nations. It's a very arcane and technical subject, which is, you know, you could write a whole long dissertation on precisely what falls on what side of the line in terms of what status things have at the United Nations. But Namibia is truly unique because it is the only territory which is UN territory until such time as the people have had a free chance to choose their own government. It is UN territory pending proper opportunity for the people themselves to set up their own government. It's a unique situation.
Mr. Ladden, I also like to compliment you on your research and documentation of the problem in Namibia. But I'd like to ask you, first, two questions. One, I would like to know, you said the United States had said that she wouldn't come to the support of any of these multinational companies. Did the United States ever restrict any of these multinational companies from working and operating in Namibia?
The United States, when it learns about a company that is going into Namibia, particularly if it learns about it through the State Department, the Commerce Department tends to have the opinion that profitable investment is profitable investment. But if the State Department learns that an American company is going to invest in Namibia, it writes a letter to the company, which, as I understand it, I've never seen one of the letters, says, we want to call your attention to the following. The United States position is so-and-so. There are such and such resolutions. We think you will be subject to certain, the United States will not protect you if your investment is challenged. The United States will not give you insurance guarantees and so on. However, if you do go in, please treat your employees well.
My second question would be, what is the United Nations position going to be when South Africa is not in the process of trying to establish a neo-colonial government there in Namibia? What is the United Nations response going to be? Will that be acceptable to the United Nations?
The United Nations has said repeatedly through Security Council resolutions that any settlement in Namibia must be on the basis of Security Council Resolution 385, of which I have a copy here. And that resolution, among other things, requires free elections, territory-wide elections, not by tribal area, but across the whole territory, under United Nations supervision and control. And I emphasize the and control, because supervision may simply mean a few observers here and there watching what goes on. And control implies that the United Nations would be responsible for the establishment of electoral lists, for the seeing that campaigning was fair, for the making sure that those who are entitled to vote would vote, and for seeing that the ballots are properly counted. That's quite different from mere supervision. And one of the important provisions of Resolution 385 is that that government must be set up on the basis of free elections under UN supervision and control.
Yes, Ms. Landis, I'd like to ask you, the United States is not a signatory to the Treaty on Genocide, is it?
No, I don't believe so.
You know, we've seen a lot of violations of human rights that have been either condoned or passed over by the United States government historically. We see the violation of Native American treaty rights, violation of human rights of blacks and other minorities here within the United States. And I don't know a lot about, law, but I know in some court cases where someone knows of an act of robbery or an act of a felony that's committed against another individual by someone else, they're often called an accomplice. Are the violations of human rights that are taking place in Namibia covered or spoken to under the treaty, the UN Treaty on Genocide? Would they be characterized as genocidal acts, some of the conditions to which the Namibian people live under?
Well, I'm sure that there would be one group of jurists who would say so. I would suppose that there would be another group of jurists who would not. This would be a philosophical question which you would debate in an appropriate court if you could ever get people before a court to debate it. I have my own personal opinion on that, but that's personal and not UN opinion. I would think that one could argue a very strong case on the subject, and my impression is that there have been some treatises written on this subject. Even I believe that there have been at least one law review article written by a South African on the subject who concludes that no, it isn't genocide, but the UN might well treat it as such.
All right, one last question. What is the relationship between the Council of Namibia, of the UN, and the liberation movement, SWAPO? And also, what is the official position, or is there one, from the Council on the group which the South African government has been promoting? I believe they call it the Windhoek Conference. Could you fill us in about that?
First question on the relationship between the Council and SWAPO. SWAPO is recognized by the United Nations as the authentic representative of the Namibian people. A SWAPO observer sits with the Council at all times that he's physically present. SWAPO has a one-man office in New York, so that it is not always available. But SWAPO sits with the Council, has the right to participate in all their discussions, but not to vote. Normally, when the Council sends a mission to, for example, take part in a conference on the law of the sea, a SWAPO representative will go with the mission sent by the Council to help represent Namibia. The second question on the Windhoek Conference, which is commonly called the Turnhalle Conference. It's called that because that's the German word for the old drill hall, which was converted for the use of this conference. The Council has made it, Council for Namibia has made it very clear that it will have no truck whatsoever with the Turnhalle Conference, that the only possible way in which independence can be brought about that will be recognized is under the terms of Security Council Resolution 385, based on free elections under United Nations supervision and control, that it will under no circumstances recognize any deliberations which are done on a fragmented Bantustan tribal basis rather than on taking Namibia as a whole. The Council looks upon the Turnhalle Conference as essentially a way of creating a weak, dependent, divided Namibia, which will always, in fact, be subject to South African rule from behind the scenes rather than now as it is imposed immediately and publicly. The Turnholler Conference itself has made very clear that for the indefinite future, it would insist upon having South African troops there to defend any government that it established, because it recognizes that certainly SWAPO and probably the vast majority of the Namibian people would never accept a Turnholler government. So that what has up to this time been a war of liberation might well turn into a civil war if there were a Turnholler puppet government with black fighting black and the Turnholler blacks supported by South African support troops.
We've heard this evening, we've heard the horrible conditions imposed on the Namibian people by foreign corporations. The Tsumeb Corporation is controlled by Amex and another American company, are the largest employer in all of Namibia. We know that the United States government is capable of controlling its companies if it so chooses. We've seen a generation of control of trade with Cuba, even to the point of preventing other nations' companies of operating in Cuba, and even preventing the shipment of medical supplies to Cuba. Is the United States government not directly responsible for conditions in Namibia?
The United States government position, as I understand it, is that it believes in free enterprise, and it can persuade, it can urge, it can do nothing more, and this is the position, by and large, of the Western European countries, that they have no control over what their companies do in a free enterprise system. It is naturally responsible for the attitude of many Namibians vis-a-vis free enterprise.
One last question. The Dean of American Newscasters, Eric Severai, just a few months ago made a statement on television that there is nothing in all of Africa of value to civilized man that was not put there by the West. If this is representative of American thought, and in particular of the attitude of the American government and the media toward Africa, have we reason to believe, in fact, that the national attitude toward Namibia and toward Africa in general is simply an extension of American racism?
Well, as a UN employee, I couldn't possibly answer that question, but I should think that the grand jury might be able to answer it without any guidance from me.
The $100 million fund we spoke about earlier, similar to the Kissinger's plan for Zimbabwe. If that wasn't cleared through the UN's Council on Namibia, or at least some sort of consultation had not been undertaken by the U.S. and that council, could this project, this offer, be considered a circumvention of the UN Council on Namibia?
Well, it's pretty hard to know exactly what this fund is all about. I mean, all I've done is read the same news reports that you've read, so that I just don't know what the answer is. I am under the impression that what they are saying is that this would aid in the transition period when Namibia had its independence, so that you would have to then go back to the chicken and egg question of what kind of independence was this meaningful independence brought about under the terms of Resolution 385, or is it a kind of a Turnholler government, which is something entirely different? I mean, we're arguing about something, or you're asking about something I just don't know enough about.
I'm asking you if it was discussed with the UN's Council on Namibia first.
No.
Then it has not been cleared in any way by the UN. And if there's been no
No.
consultation with that council, then it can't be considered a council's policy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
My other question is, the council, you say, has the authority to license companies, and has it done so?
No, it has not.
Have companies applied to the council for licensure?
While I've been in the office, I've received about half a dozen telephone calls asking about licensing. And each time I have said, please submit your questions in writing, indicating who you are by name, what company you represent, what you're interested in. And my anonymous telephone callers, who are different, have all not written anything.
They've never identified themselves.
Usually not. Once in a while I've gotten so far as to push somebody into admitting what law firm he or she works for, but that's as far as it's ever gone.
Yes, I'd like to talk a little bit about people. I'd like to ask you a question about people. I've heard a lot of talk about governments and money, but I've heard no talk about the people of Africa. And it appears to me, it really appears to me that the white man, again, with the yellow, the black, and the red people, always think that he is incapable of handling his own affairs. If these governments and these oil companies and these coal companies, if they're forced out of Africa, and you said that they're educating people in different parts of the world to come into Africa and take over, isn't this just an extension of the white way that these black people were educated, that they're bringing back into Africa? And another question is, I like to ask, what will happen to the uneducated black who cannot read, who's just a hardworking person, when these new governments take over?
Well, the hope is that those who, Namibians, and we're not talking about foreigners now, we're talking about Namibians who have been educated, will be teachers and nurses and will be performing vital services. I don't want to get into the philosophical question of whether people are better off without any Western education or not. But once you know that people's lives can be saved by inoculating against smallpox, it's pretty hard to turn your back on it and say we won't inoculate. The philosophical problem of what you do about basic education, whether people are taught to read and write at all, and if they're taught to read and write, shouldn't they be taught to read and write well, so that they can read what they want to and pass their own judgments, is, you know, you're getting into a really philosophical question. I think it is completely true that people who go away from their own country when their own country is a developing country frequently are corrupted by the luxury and the different ways of life of the places where they go. And this is one of the reasons why the Institute for Namibia was set up in Lusaka, which was at that time physically as close as you could get in any place where you could really assemble a lot of people together. The nearest country that had the facilities and could absorb the number of people involved. And that was one of the very important reasons for having the institute established in Lusaka, so that it would be close to home. There would be constant ebb and flow of people going back and forth across the border. People would keep in touch with their families and would be in a country that was not so advanced that they couldn't go back to other and simpler conditions when the time came. Beyond that, when you're getting into the question of emigres and what happens to people who go out, what happens to people once they've been to Paris and whether they go back to the farm again, that's a philosophical question that you just have to decide for yourself. I mean, the UN cannot take a position on something like that, because it's beyond any kind of simple, even a simple political answer.
In answer to the juror's question about license, you said some law firms had called for license.
had called for information.
For information, could you identify who those law firms?
I don't think I even remember now, but I wouldn't if I could.
Okay. I'd like to say, in all of the actions that the UN has taken in sanctioning South Africa's control over Namibia, what has been America's stand in each one of in this role when they've taken votes in it? Has it abstained or has it supported these sanctions?
Well, there really hasn't been much of anything that you can call sanctions. Let's start with that.
Well, when the vote was taken that they illegally occupied.
There are resolutions every year. During the Kennedy administration, the United States probably took a stronger position than most of Western Europe. Obviously, it did not take as strong a position as Eastern Europe or a majority of the African states. In recent years, the United States position has, from the African point of view, been getting progressively worse. The United States joined twice in vetoes of proposed arms embargo against South Africa based on its operations in Namibia. I mean, there might be other reasons for embargoing arms to South Africa, but this was a specifically Namibia-based operation. These were resolutions which would have followed up on Resolution 366 and 385. 366 and 385 are substantially the same. Everybody is now very interested in what will happen. We think that there will be a Security Council meeting specifically on Namibia in mid-June after a conference which is planned